Okay, we're on. I think we're ready for a reflection from Steve.
Thank you, Phil. First of all, I wanted to recognize St. Patrick's Day. I did find a green shirt in my closet to commemorate the spirit of today. Before I begin what I've planned for my reflection, I do want to acknowledge that yesterday, by a vote of 68 to 27, the U.S. Senate is moving toward the repeal of the 1991 and 2002 authorization for the use of military force in Iraq, the AUMF. This was literally one of the earliest initiatives of ICUJP, one of our goals. This open-ended blank check, which the United States government has used consistently over the last 21 years, has been a stain, among others, on American foreign policy. And the notion that finally our government is moving toward taking it off the books is significant. As some of you and most of you know, we've moved up here to Sonoma. I've been unpacking boxes and going down memory lane in my life. And I found one thing that I think is significant and worth sharing with you in a reflection. In the fall of 1990, I was asked to be a guest editor for the Western Legal History Journal published by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I wrote an article for that journal on Charlotte Anita Whitney, who was a member of the Communist Labor Party and was convicted under the 1919 Criminal Syndicalism Act. And her case produced one of the most eloquent statements on First Amendment rights by Justice Louis Brandeis. That was my individual article, but I wrote a short opening to the entire volume, and I just want to read a few brief excerpts, and the end of this is what, in a rare prophetic moment in what I had to say and what I saw coming. The introduction itself says that the 200th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights in December 1790 is a bittersweet occasion. Bitter because it recalls times distant and not so distant when our cherished freedoms were suspended in the name of patriotism, national security, or dangerous ideas. Bitter because it reminds us that the Bill of Rights often depends upon the tolerance of intolerant people, the faith of insecure people, and the courage of fearful people. Bitter because today there is a rising tide of censorship fueled by demagogues inside and outside government. But this is also a sweet occasion, sweet because the Bill of Rights has endured despite these setbacks, sweet because time and again courageous people, lawyers and judges and ordinary citizens have valiantly defended the Bill of Rights, enhancing the sum total of liberty enjoyed by us all. Sweet because 200 years later, the Bill of Rights remains an inspiration to peoples and governments around the world, a symbol that individual freedom and national unity can prosper together. Skipping ahead to the end of this introduction, I wrote, the articles in this issue reflect a common theme that runs throughout the history of the Bill of Rights. In the words of Justice Robert H. Jackson, writing for the majority in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943, quote, The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. I continue my writing. It is tempting to become smug and nostalgic about our commitment to the Bill of Rights. With years of hindsight, we eagerly express our righteous indignation over the struggles of the Chinese, Mormons, Native Americans, Latinos, African Americans, and women. We even embrace the protection of the constitutional rights of radicals and communists. From a distant historical perspective, it's easy to support the constitutional rights of groups and individuals who pose no current threat to us. It is far more difficult to defend the constitutional rights of those who are out of fashion or who represent alien ideologies. Again, I'm writing in 1990. The potential for prolonged war in the Middle East has already generated a rash of anti-Arab sentiment expressed in everything from hateful songs and jokes to serious death threats. The U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service has attempted to deport Palestinian students under the infamous McCarran-Walter Act for their mere membership in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, due to their exercise of the rights of freedom of expression and association fully protected by the Bill of Rights. As Michael Linfield puts it in his recent book, Freedom Under Fire, U.S. Civil Liberties in Times of War, quote, civil liberties and individual freedoms are one of the first casualties of war. As war approaches, a panoply of restrictions are imposed on the civilian population, restrictions that generally last long after peace is declared. War hysteria, xenophobia, and fear of subversion all outlive the shooting war. Wartime hatred fueled by patriotic rhetoric infects the citizenry. Political opportunists and demagogues have played to these fears, instituting massive restrictions on civil liberties and clamping down on real or supposed dissidents long after any possible threat to the nation's security has vanished. And finishing with my last paragraph, forcing ourselves to confront present-day intolerance and political repression transforms the articles in this issue into more than historical curiosities. They serve to remind us that a true commitment to the Bill of Rights requires eternal vigilance, here and now, each day, lest we are doomed to repeat the violations of the past. I wrote that in the fall of 1990. Unfortunately, I've rarely written truer, more prophetic words. 11 years later, our government once again cast aside the Bill of Rights, ignored the lessons of the past, and engaged in sweeping violation of civil liberties in the name of the war on terror, particularly against Muslims. And yet again, the cycle continues with Trump's Muslim ban and down to today. Eternal vigilance is demanded of us yet again. I'm very proud of ICUJP throughout the last 21 years for understanding this history and trying to remind the greater society and the greater world of these lessons. And we're still at that work today. Thanks very much.
Okay, very good. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you with us.
Nice to see you again, Dick. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been. Okay, I want to draw from a bio that Mark kindly sent me, and I'm going to have to, he's done so much, I'm going to kind of work my way through it selectively. Mark is the Criminal Justice Chair of NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, Greater Los Angeles County. Now, NAMI does stand for National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so specifically, he is the chair of the criminal justice sector of the Greater Los Angeles County NAMI. Mark represents NAMI on the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Criminal Justice Mental Health Advisory Board. He currently serves as a member of the Permanent Steering Committee of the Office of Diversion and Reentry, and he represents NAMI on a number of county committees engaged in the Los Angeles County Care First, Jails Last, Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative. He assists in leading the NAMI Crisis Intervention Team partnership with law enforcement in Los Angeles County. He's recently been appointed to the Expanding Crisis Response Committee for the Council of State Governments Justice Center. So these are just a few of the positions he's held, and he's received some notable awards for his really significant work. And I should add that Mark is the father of a son with serious mental illness. So the theme is care first and jail last. And Mark, we're certainly looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Dick. So, Mark, you want to carry it forward?
Sure. Thank you, Dick. Appreciate the intro. I'm hardwired, so the internet should work well. It's awfully early in the morning to talk about serious mental illness after one cup of coffee. I'm going to give it a go. Like Dick, I am the father of a son with a serious mental illness. I have a son with schizophrenia. Unusually for most people, he started to become psychotic at about 13 or 14. Usually it happens much later, late teens, early 20s. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling his story, but suffice it to say, he was in trouble with the law as a juvenile and then again as an adult. So I have no fascination with the criminal justice system. I don't watch Law and Order. I don't like cop shows. That's my wife. But I had no choice because my son would not take meds, refuse treatment, refuse to cooperate, refuse to engage with counselors or psychiatrists. And as he got sicker and sicker and sicker, his behavior became more and more extreme, and he started, committing some misdemeanors and felonies, and he got himself in a lot of trouble. And so I found myself when he was late 18, early maybe 19, being arrested as an adult down at Twin Towers. He was in jail 4 different times. He lost a total of a year of his life. So my introduction to the system did not come through an intellectual exercise or wanting to, or through an academic exercise. This was all, I was just a dad. We were dealing with the school and counselors just like you would, trying to do the best we could to raise our kid. And had to send him out of state facility for a year when he was a minor. But once he became an adult, as we'll learn a little bit later in the talk, a law called the Lanterman-Petra Short Act took over, what we call LPS, You will know it is danger to self, danger to others, or gravely disabled. We call it LPS. It's the involuntary commitment statutes for our state that were written, by the way, in 1967. So clearly not written with advanced and modern science in mind. So I went on a long journey with him. I went through 15 really horrible years. We almost lost him twice. He spent a year of his life in jail. And for me, becoming an advocate was part of my recovery. I couldn't fix him. I could not, but I had to fix something to feel better and to make myself stronger. So I found advocacy to be very empowering for myself. And I threw myself into it wholeheartedly because what I saw was utter catastrophe. A whole population of people just thrown under the bus. And I wanted to know why. And I wanted to know why it was okay. And everybody that I met, like Dick and other NAMI members, you know, I was meeting people whose sons and daughters were also in jail or had committed serious crimes and were in prison or were not guilty by reason of insanity and in a state hospital. And I had some amazing mentors early on in my advocacy career. And, you know, I just really started, I wanted a bigger platform. NAMI's very great at taking people who are new, don't know what they're doing, and really need help, somebody explaining mental illness to them and helping people. And they also advocated at national and state level. There was nothing going on in the county. We had no mental health courts. We had no jail diversion programs to speak of. It was wrong. And I met some people who taught me that things could be different. People like Santa Clara Superior Court Judge Stephen Manley, who I met in 2003. I've been doing this for 20 years, who's a hero of mine. And I was able to be on a Judicial Council task force with him from 2008 to 2012, where we basically wrote the template, the Bible, for mental health courts and collaborative justice courts in the state of California. And that is called the Judicial Council's Task Force on Criminal Justice Collaboration on Mental Health Issues. I still remember that very, very long name. And to this day, I sit on the Collaborative Justice Courts Advisory Committee and Judge Manley's Mental Health Subcommittee, where we really focus on legislation. So Dick says, well, just explain to everybody why people with mental illness are getting criminalized. It's such a simple topic, but I'm going to try to boil it down into some simple parts. So if you're not familiar with the subject matter, and you're probably not, why this is going on, why this is discriminatory, and why I fight against it so hard. And so we, as a society, we make choices. And those choices are based on fiscal decisions, what we fund, what we choose to fund, what we choose not to fund, and the laws that we write. You know, they don't come down from on high. People make these laws. Sometimes they're good laws, sometimes they're poorly written laws. Sometimes they have unintended consequences. You know, we're dealing with very, very dated statutes in mental health. But the simple answer to the question, why are so many people with serious mental illness in jail or prison, is I'll boil it down to one sentence. If people, and I'm really speaking of the sickest of the sick, okay? I'm talking people who are very, very severely and persistently mentally ill. Not your average person who's got an anxiety disorder and went to see therapy or had a life event that created depression. I'm not saying those are not serious issues, but where I focus on, you know, and then people can go maybe get some medication or some talk therapy and get help. We all go through that all the time. We get a divorce or somebody that we love passes away and dies. And you know, that's called sort of situational depression. But I'm really talking about very, very chronic depression, severe bipolar disorder, severe schizoaffective disorder, severe schizophrenia. They're the people you see on the freeway ramps, or the guy who's walking down the street screaming and yelling at people who are not there. And until you've loved somebody who speaks to two people who aren't there, it's heartbreaking. So you really can't understand what that's like until you see your own son do it. But that's him, you know, and he knows when he comes home, he can do whatever he wants. He's okay. But there were years I couldn't let him in the door. So, and he hasn't lived home since he was 17. It's just, except for a 6-week trial when he was 26. He turned 40 the other day. My son has been in recovery since he was 27, since we had a conservatorship. So we're a success story. We're lucky. He hasn't been in jail or committed a crime in many, many, many years. He hasn't been in a hospital in 14 years. He takes his medication now, and and that saved his life. So I don't have a tragic story to tell, but I have lots of friends who do, and I work with them. So let me boil it down a little bit. So if people don't get the level of care that they need, so say you're really ill and you need acute inpatient care or long-term residential locked care in an IMD because you're a conservatee. An IMD is a terrible name, Institute of Mental Disease. It's a name that Congress gave any facility greater than 16 beds. Now, why did Congress do this? Way back when they wrote the Medicaid legislation. I'm talking about 1965. Okay, when Kennedy and Johnson, you know, back in that era. And the federal government said, we're not going to pay for state hospitals. That's a state purview. It's a state cost, and we're just not going to do it. So we're not going to allow the states to take federal money and pay for state hospitals or any facility that's larger than 16 beds. That was the number they came up with. Well, if you don't have an economy of scale, you don't have enough business to pay your fixed costs, what happens? You go out of business. A psychiatric facility is no different. If they don't have enough people to make enough money, especially for Medicaid reimbursement levels, to stay afloat, pay the bills, keep the lights on, guess what? All these beds are going away and shrinking. So this is the federal discrimination against people with severe mental illness, where the Fed said, not my problem, your problem. Because back then, go back to the mid-60s, we wanted to close the state hospitals. We wanted to get people who were inappropriately detained at the time with no due process out of the state hospitals and into community-based care. What they were supposed to do, and like in the state of California, they were going to close the state hospitals, let everybody out, because they changed the SSI rules so people with a mental disorder could get SSI, Social Security Supplemental Income, besides people who had like a physical disability, who might be in a wheelchair or lost an arm or something. So when that changed, then the state says, oh, okay, we'll let everybody state hospitals, we'll put them in the community, they'll get SSI, they'll have a funding stream to stay alive, and we'll appropriate all this money and we'll give it to the states as block grants, and we will build a community mental health system to serve all these folks. Very well intentioned. Well, they took the money and they didn't build a community mental health system. They built prisons. Where do you think everybody ended up? Behind bars. There are graphs you can see where the state hospital population goes down while the incarceration levels go up. And after LPS was passed in 67, it became law in January 69, people started to go, why are there so many people homeless with serious mental illness? Close the state hospital. Why isn't the community taking care of them? Okay. So the IMD exclusion, where the feds won't help pay, won't give the federal financing participation, Medicaid matching dollars for any facility that treats serious mental illness over 16 beds. All right. That's why if you go to an acute psychiatric hospital, they're always very small, 16 beds or less. The Martin Luther King campus, we were building a restorative village, all levels of care on one site. Great idea. We wanted to have like 60 different acute beds, but we couldn't build one building with one facility with one set of staff. We had to build 4 buildings with 4 different staffs, 4 different treatment providers, so we would avoid the IMD exclusion, and the state's been dragging their heels on a waiver. So there's your federal piece, because this is complicated. It's not just California. Let's talk about state discrimination. So the state of California has, more complicated than this, 2 basic funding streams. One is called the Mental Health Services Act. You may have heard about it. Proposition 63 from 2004, 1% tax on millionaires, right? Everybody wants to tax the millionaires, creating about $2 billion a year. And we were going to take that money and serve people with serious mental illness. But when they implemented it, they implemented it in such a way that it would be only for voluntary services only, all right, for the outpatient system. We don't want to put people in hospitals anymore. We want to serve them in the community. We don't want to put people in restrictive environments. We want to put people in the least restrictive environment, which is fine. That's the way it should be. But they left no money for the people who need hospitalization level of care or an inpatient level of care, or say they're gravely disabled and they get an LPS conservatorship and they need to be placed, detained in a locked facility, in a residential facility for about a year or 2 until they can be stabilized. And then you can step them down into a community-based program that is not locked, and now they're back in the community, and give them the services and supports they need to reintegrate into the community. So the state has the Mental Health Services Act, which serves some very sick people, but it's voluntary. So the sickest of the sick refuse treatment. The sickest of the sick don't know they're sick. Now, why is that? So there's a clinical term called anosognosia. Anosognosia in plain English means lack of insight. I'm too ill to know I'm ill. So if I think that the FBI is tapping my phone and the CIA is stalking me and there's a car full of agents outside, if I really believe that, I'm terrified, because that's real to me. That's my hallucination, my delusion, my psychosis. But psychosis is real to the person that has it. Everybody else goes, no, that's not real. But to the person who's experiencing it, it's extremely real. They don't know they're ill. If they knew they're ill, they would go through the rational, informed decision-making process of something must be wrong. This is not normal. My belief system is completely detached from reality. I need to go to get some help. And I know many people who have hit that sort of aha moment and then have sought help voluntarily and recovered. But the people who are on Skid Row, who are severely and persistently mentally ill, or standing on the freeway ramp screaming and yelling, they have anosognosia. They don't know they're ill. And even if they know it, they have the legal right under LPS statutes to refuse treatment. The part of the system that pays for these folks, all right, acute inpatient, and I'm speaking specifically of acute care or subacute long-term locked residential care, is what we call 1991 mental health realignment revenue. What pays that? 0.25% sales tax, vehicle license registration fees, and late fees. Those are the 3 pots of money, all right? So when we have a recession and we sell less cars, guess what? We cut beds. Now that's a way to fund a healthcare system. And I'm being very sarcastic, that's nuts, but that's what we got. You can't use MHSA money to build an acute hospital if you have a bed shortage, right? But you can use realignment revenue. But realignment revenue, the formula, discriminates against the people who are the most sick, because if you looked at the last 5 fiscal years, the budget is up maybe 6% or essentially flat. MHSA revenues point to point over any 5-year period are up 50%. So, they've gone from $1 billion to $2 billion. so the outpatient system is being liberally funded. The acute system, the subacute system, which is the part of the system that helps the people who are the most seriously ill, is starved for resources. All right, so we're supposed to have 50 beds per 100,000 people. California's, I believe, 17. LA County is 23, less than half of what we need. So there's great resource. So now that decision was made by lawmakers. It's purposeful. You know, if you put a system in place that lasts for 50 years and it's discriminatory against people, then I say it's a choice. Well, we can make a different choice, right? We can change those funding streams. So we got the feds discriminating against the people who are most sick with the IMD exclusion, and the state of California discriminating against the people who are most sick because 1991, they always take the growth money away from us. It's complicated, but it's fiscal discrimination. So if people don't get the level of care that they need, there's 5 catastrophic outcomes that happen. They might end up in a state hospital, usually incompetent to stand trial. They might end up in jail or a prison or homeless and victimized. And unfortunately, in too many cases, people also die from serious mental illness. So, you know, if you don't give people what they need, the results are predictable, right? So we're fighting really hard as advocates to change laws, to change funding streams, to tell the story. And if you really want to get into the weeds on this stuff, I did a podcast for Heart Forward LA. Carrie Morrison's wonderful podcast. I call Carrie my dear friend, the Terry Gross of mental health, if you know who Terry Gross is. She's got three seasons worth of 10 episodes each. They're all great, great podcasts about the mental health system. Mine is the last episode of season 3, the last one. And I warn you, it's a bit long, but if you really want to get into the detail, I break it down there. So what's next? The other part of the problem is the law itself. So the law discriminates. Now, you got to go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s when people were inappropriately detained in state hospitals, and these 3 lawmakers wanted to provide legal due process, right, for people. Because back then, you could commit somebody and they couldn't get out, and they couldn't file a writ, and they couldn't get a court hearing. And until the doctor signed them out, they couldn't get out of the state hospital. No due process. Well, that was wrong. So that had to be fixed, right? And people who belonged in nursing homes were being put in state hospitals. That's wrong. And somebody wanted to get rid of a political foe, or maybe your wife, you could get them committed, say she's crazy, lock her up, she's gone. This kind of crap that was going on. Now, in the old days, there were a few state hospitals around the country that were caretaking facilities. You know, people lived a more rural life. They grew their own gardens and their food, and they all pitched in and helped take care of the place. But there were very few like that. Most of them were more like warehouses and awful places. So that with the best of intentions, they put through the LPS law. But the bar is so high that so you can't get somebody detained against their will for an evaluation unless they're dangerous. So they're either threatening suicide, threatening somebody else with bodily harm, or grave disability. The definition of grave disability under California law is the inability to take care of one's personal needs for food, shelter, and clothing. So think about that, you know, and the way judges interpret it is if people were homeless, if they can find food, they're not gravely disabled. If it's cold and they know to put a coat on, or hot and they know to take the coat off, they're not gravely disabled. It's a very, 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 very high bar. And we're trying to get the definition of grave disability changed to include medical problems. I have a good friend, Dr. Susan Portovi, who runs homeless healthcare on Skid Row. She's got people refusing, and she's not a psychiatrist, she's a regular MD. She's got people with terrible, terrible afflictions who need medical care, you know, diabetes, gangrene, all sorts of stuff, ulcers on them, open sores. She wants to treat them, but they're mentally ill and they're so sick they won't let her treat them. So isn't that gravely disabled? If somebody has a doctor saying, if you don't let me treat this, you're going to die, and they refuse treatment, they're gravely disabled. Somebody needs to step in and save their lives, all right? Because that's what we're talking about. So LPS, which was supposed to facilitate appropriate treatment, instead has acted as a barrier to treatment. You can't get a bed because we don't fund them. Even if there was an open bed, the criteria is so high, oftentimes, unless you're dangerous, you don't get one. Because if there's a scarcity of resources, only the most dangerous and aggressive people are going to get a bed, right? If you're just gravely disabled, you're going to be left on the street. And then, of course, the fourth piece is the county resources, the lack of funding, the inability to have permanent supportive housing with services and supports, the inability to build hospitals or IMDs, or even crisis resources for people. When you put all those together, isn't it any wonder that very, very sick people are ending up on our streets and our jails and prison? So there's a revolving door. You hear about the revolving door. What's the revolving door and who are they? So early on in the Permanent Steering Committee for ODR, for the Office of Diversion and Reentry, I looked at all my colleagues and friends from DMH and I said, you got to identify who the revolving door client is and why, and track them and understand what's happening to them. It is not your mental health client who walks into a clinic and says, I need help. That's not who's in jail. Who's in jail? The person who is not engaged with the system for whatever reason. They're refusing to engage in treatment. They're going from the hospital to the jail to the street, back to the hospital, back to the street, back to jail, back. That's your revolving door. Those are the sickest of our sick clients in the county and throughout the state. And we allow them to go round and round. Well, jail is the bed that never says no. I'm sorry, there's no hospital beds today, but if they've committed a crime, we can put them in jail. So consequently, the percentage of people with mental illness in Twin Towers and the LA jail system, used to be 25 to 30%, is now 40%. The women, and I scream about this all the time because we're failing our women terribly, 66% of the women in our jail facility have severe and persistent mental illness. Think about that, 2/3. So we are using jails as warehouses for people who are very sick. It's unconscionable. And it's got to end. So when my son was arrested, my son was in trouble, and I spent 5 years keeping him out of prison. That was back 20 years ago. We had no mental health courts. We had one court linkage program, which saved my son's life and kept him from going to prison, but they have 50 beds. At county of 10 million people, they had 50 beds, and they're the only locked forensic beds in the state, by the way, are 50 beds. And they were 50 20 years ago, and they're still just 50, except I'm working on it. So we're hoping to get a new facility, get people who are very sick out of jail into a secure treatment facility. So judges and district attorneys will allow people, a lot of times judges and DAs will say privately, there's a lot of people that committed a serious crime. I just can't let them go out into the community. What if they hurt someone? We can't, or hurt themselves. Their crime is too serious to allow them to be in an unsecure setting. However, I don't have to send them to jail or prison. I can't punish the mental illness out of them. They figured that out. So if I had a secure treatment facility, I'd sentence them there in a heartbeat, but it doesn't exist. So my default is jail and prison. So this is what's happening to people, and people can't get what they need. They can't get the level of care that they need. They end up acting out, coming to the attention of law enforcement. I participated in the process in LA County for Care First, Jails Last, Alternatives to Incarceration. Back when Jackie Lacey was district attorney, that's when the task force started. And what we did is we incepted something called the sequential intercept model. So if you're interested in what's going on in criminal justice and what's going on how we're all trying to deal with this, I would tell you to Google the sequential intercept model. That's the academic term. Dr. Mark Munitz wrote that from Northeastern Ohio University. He's actually giving a talk on March 23 through the Treatment Advocacy Center. That's what LA is doing. And we're using something called the Stepping Up Initiative. So if you Google Stepping Up Initiative, that is essentially a marketing campaign to counties for best practice. And that's the National Association of Counties, the Council of State Governments, NAMI, the American Psychiatric Association. So we know how to do this. There's a lot of research now. We know how to do this, and we know what works and we know what doesn't work, but we refuse to fund it to scale. So while we see all the terrible tragedies in the newspaper, and while we hear the horrible stories over and over and over again, we continue not to fund it. My Office of Diversion and Reentry here in the county, we ended up with a $30 million structural deficit. The county closed the portal for new cases for 2 years. So if you needed ODR diversion, and diversion means divert to what? Divert from incarceration to treatment, divert from jail to community-based services. All right. You would think that we would be funding that hand over fist, because when we started doing it, we got $130 million to start the Office of Diversion and Reentry. But the permanent supportive housing costs are so expensive. We got to 2,200 beds, and the Board of Supervisors literally had a fiscal freak out and said, oh my God, this is too expensive. We can't subsidize permanent supportive housing for the rest of these people's lives. We're capping it at 2,200. And advocates like myself, we got pretty incensed about the whole thing. For 2 years, diversion for new cases came to a grinding halt. We just got an appropriation, and I'm talking, it was a 2-year fight. And we got another round of funding for 1 more year to add 750 beds. So now we're doing diversion again in LA County. But we got to, fight and scream and claw our way to funding to do it. And so part of what I do is, besides working on state legislation, and I work with other advocacy organizations besides NAMI. I'm a new California ambassador for the Treatment Advocacy Center. So we are going to be working on legislation. I'm with the Grave Disability Work Group. I mentioned Susan Bartovi, that's her work group. So I'm working with various other work groups to bring another family voice besides NAMI California into the mix, so we can be as loud and as forceful as possible. So I don't know, Dick, it's 8:34, 8:35. Should we take some questions, or I hope this helps you understand that these crises are self-perpetuating, and that it's our fault. We caused them in the first place, and so it's incumbent upon the legislature to fix it. Watch the bills from Senator Susan Eggman. By the way, this is the most important year in Sacramento in my 20 years of doing it. So there's always some committee chair who's opposed to what you want to do, who kills bills. You write a good bill, oh, this will really help. We all advocate for it. Sometimes it passes and the governor vetoes it. Sometimes you can't get it passed because it gets killed in committee. But we have 2 allies in Susan Eggman and Senator Mansheim, Assemblymember Mansheim on. So she's the Senate Health Committee, the Assembly Judiciary Committee. We've never before had both of those important committees with an ally for reform and change. This is our year. We're going after it big time. So Dave Clennon, you were the first hand to go up.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I want to thank Dick Bunce for for making us aware of these conditions over the years. First of all, I wanted to get the full name of a process that you call sequential intercept something.
Sequential intercept model.
model. Okay, thank you for that. And
Do you want a document that shows LA County's version of implementation? I could drop one in the chat if I can find it. You keep talking. We'll keep talking. I'll look for it.
Okay. My other question is the name of the podcast that you appeared on. I think you said there's a series of 3 years worth of programming.
Right.
And you appeared in 1 year. What is how can we access that program?
I'm going to put a link in the chat for you too. It's called Heart Forward LA.
Thank you. I have a friend whose husband has gone through some mental disorders, and I don't think that he has anosognosia. It's certainly not permanently, but he does, lay terms, take leave of his senses at times. It's partly due to medications, all kinds of medications for physical conditions, medications for psychological conditions. I suppose the most extreme example is when he attempted to strangle his wife. So very, very serious behavioral disorders interspersed with periods of lucidity. And when he knows what he has done and he regrets it and he never wants it to happen again, but if he doesn't get the right balance of physical and psychological medications, he can go off again. And this is, I mean, his condition is, I'm thinking nowhere near as severe as the conditions of other people that you have described. But my friend's life was in danger from his behavior, and they had insurance, but it wasn't it wasn't the full coverage program. So he went from being, I don't know that he was ever incarcerated. I think he was in police custody and being transported to a facility of some kind. But as soon as he stabilized, the hospital would dismiss him.
So I know where you're going. So number one, everything I talked about was the public mental health system. There is a private mental health system. We fought for mental health, what's called parity. You used to get a very small mental health benefit, a very small substance use disorder benefit. We're now supposed to have parity where mental illnesses get the same insurance coverage as as physical illnesses. In practice, it doesn't really happen in the state of California, and it's a big problem. And the private insurance companies don't provide all the community services and supports that the public system does. And that's another disparity where some things are paid for by the public system, because basically private insurance is going to give you a hospitalization, medication, psychiatrist, a therapist, and that's about it. Go try to find a day program or a partial hospitalization program, with like 5-6 hours a day of group work with people. They don't do it. They don't pay for it. So it's a huge problem. And then the other thing you touched on is, under the rules, you got to meet medical necessity or they won't pay. So basically, hospitalizations, acute psychiatric hospitals are not there for recovery. They're there to keep people alive. So once you're no longer dangerous to self or others, or gravely disabled, so you get stabilized on your medication a little bit, you're booted. And because you no longer meet the medical necessity rules, and either Medicaid or the insurance company says, we're not paying. That person doesn't meet medical necessity. They're no longer a danger to themselves, and they let them go. So people don't get not only the level of care they need, but often the the sustained treatment that they need. If you talk to psychiatrists, they'll say, it's really hard to help people in 5 days, 3 days. If I had a month, I could really help some people. If I had a month or two, even 28 days, it'd be a whole different paradigm. Rose Leibowitz.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
Sure.
I was just wondering about your feeling about the CARE Act. I work very closely with unhoused people in the area where I live. And just a very quick anecdote. I'll keep this short. There's a gentleman lives in my street. He's been there for over 20 years, according to my neighbors. He looks like a scarecrow. He is almost completely mute. And he lies down and he plays music by banging 2 spoons together for most of the day. And recently, some people from the Department of Mental Health got in touch with me and asked me to identify him because he'd been reported to them. And so I pointed out where he was and sent them a photo. And now they're kind of, so to speak, working with him. But I'm kind of nervous. Under the CARE Act, I would hate them to take him to court and him being forced into some kind of mental health treatment. To my knowledge, he's never hurt anybody. He's just there. So I just wanted your opinion on that.
So the CARE Act, number one, is directed only some people with very severe mental illness. If you look at who's in jail, who is homeless, these are people mainly with psychotic disorders, okay? People with mental illness, it's not against the law to make lousy choices, okay? In the medical community, you need to be able to make informed consent in order, the medical community deals with this very well. If you have cancer and you want to either refuse treatment or accept treatment, as long as you have the cognitive ability to make informed consent, you can make that choice for yourself. You're allowed to. But if you don't have the medical decision-making capacity to make good choices for yourself, which means you don't have the capacity to make informed consent, that's not in the law. It should be. Now, the CARE Act can't force treatment on anybody. There is no involuntary administration of psychotropic medication in the state of California without something called a Reese hearing. It's a court hearing in front of a judge or a hearing officer to determine capacity. Does this person have the capacity to appreciate the pros and cons of treatment? The CARE Act can't force anything, but the CARE Act can take us a mental health system that is absolutely failing these people, all right? And yes, bring them into court, try to use the black robe effect of the judge to help people get engaged. If they, and we also have something called assisted outpatient treatment, or AOT, commonly referred to as Laura's Law, which the CARE Act is sort of modeled after, but it's different. Will it work? We'll find out maybe. But the bottom line is, if they sort of can engage through the CARE Act or through the CARE Court, they can refer to AOT. If that doesn't work, they could refer for an LPS evaluation in a hospital, and then CARE Court's done, and LPS takes over because the person's in a hospital, right? So you can make a referral, but there is no forcing of treatment at all. But the opposition, who doesn't like it because they feel it's coercive. But at some point, do you let just people die with their rights on? Or do you help them? So you have to have strict legal criteria to make those determinations. Carol Francis Likens. I'm trying to get to everybody if I can in the 15 minutes we got.
Yeah, it seems to me, and I really appreciate you're going through the whole legal and struggle to change our system, but it seems to me that one of the reasons why, like you were talking about, people not accepting that and not being able to accept that there's something wrong, that problem plus the problem of people despising or hating the people that are on the street or get on the buses or trains yelling at somebody that doesn't exist,
Right,
is a matter of shame and blaming and making people feel like, if I say that you're losing your eyesight or that you're going deaf, you're not ashamed of that. You don't feel like he's insulting me.
right. You're referring
But
to stigma.
What?
You're referring to stigma. The stigma. Of mental health.
Yeah. So it seems to me that the stigma, both with the person who has this mental illness and refuses to take it, or the persons who react to this person on the train shouting to nobody, is the stigma. So if we could understand more what causes a person. It's not a choice that people make. I think I'll lose my mind. So is it a physical thing? Is it a mental brain disorder? Is it
It is a brain disorder.
Is it caused by, is it hereditary, or is it caused by what they eat, or about things that happen around them that causes their mental?
Okay, so in
what?
the interest of time, yes, there is a genetic component. It does run in families. Okay, they've done that research. So there is, some of us we're all at risk for different things in our DNA. Some people are at risk for mental illness in their DNA. And sometimes there's an environmental or personal thing that happens that can act as a trigger and set that off. The stigma is a huge part of the problem. It's why things don't get funded. Human beings have been unkind to each other for thousands of years. It's time we got our act together, and our country's never been more divided than it is today. And, we don't do this very well, but there are many, many families throughout the state who have had enough. And we are really rising up this year. And it's important that we talk about people appropriately. We label people as diagnosed. Well, he's bipolar. She's schizophrenic. No, she's a woman suffering from schizophrenia. He's a man who lives with bipolar disorder. He's not that disorder. He's a human being with an affliction, right? With a medical condition. So yeah, that's part of a public education process. But it does. If you're a lawmaker and you're filled with stigma, you may not vote the way I want you to vote. It's real important to shame it. Rick, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very enlightening. And, this past week, there was a gentleman by the name of Jim Gordon, who in the 70s was...
Great drummer. I'm a drummer.
Amazing. Yeah. Derek and the Dominoes. Oh, that's a nice set.
It's an old 1977 set of Camp Ghosts.
Oh, yeah, we have to sidebar on that.
Okay.
But for people who don't know, he was on Pet Sounds on Derek and the Dominoes' Layla.
Yeah.
He was the session guy in the 70s. He was misdiagnosed with alcohol abuse, but he was actually schizophrenic, and he wasn't properly diagnosed until I think 87, when the voices in his head told him to kill his mom. And he's gone from being incarcerated for life to being in an institution in the last years of his life, and he passed away this past week. So It's been an ongoing issue. I wanted to see what the best way for ICUJP in your eyes is to be helpful in some of the endeavors that NAMI is doing. Is it if you guys are having congressional meetings or with state or congressional representatives out here on any of the legal I'm
Okay.
sorry, I think I'm trying to say.
Right. So NAMI National, we're a 3-level organization. So NAMI National, which is sort of the mothership of NAMI back east in Virginia, we have our own lobbyists and our policy experts. So we're in Congress every day advocating on federal legislation. And matter of fact, Grace Napolitano, Congressman Napolitano, had a bill last year, 2611, that apparently has failed. She's coming back, I believe, with 2601 to repeal the IMD exclusion. So what's happening at the federal level is we're going for a full repeal, but if we can't get it, can we bring the number up from 16 beds to 40 or 50? That would at least help. That's going on. In the state of California, every NAMI state has its own state organization. I served on the NAMI California Board of Directors and chaired criminal justice and public policy for 6 years when I was on the state board. I termed out in 2012, and we are advocating at the state level on, like Susan Eggman's legislation and Senator Niello's legislation, and the CARE Act, when Disability Rights of California has put a lawsuit to trying to kill the CARE Act, and we're trying to combat that. So what I do as a local NAMI representative in LA County, my purview is county. Much of what I do is in Zooms, in public testimony, in county meetings. I attend more Zooms and county meetings than you can shake a stick at. And I did a lot is behind the scenes. You get to know supervisors, staff, you meet with them. I used to have to drive downtown all the time. Now I can do it on Zoom, but we get a lot accomplished through email and Zooms and working with supervisors, staff. There's a motion that's coming. I always say, please give me a heads up. We'll write position papers. You'll hear us testify at Board of Supervisor hearings. So that's sort of our purview, is how we spend the county money and what should we work for in the county. So each NAMI jurisdiction is working on things at the time. Phil Way.
Yes, thank you very much. Your presentation speaks deeply to me. I'm really appreciative of your presentation and of what you're doing in the world.
Thank you.
I have been close to people with mental health issues. Primarily a son who started becoming expressing suicidal ideation at the age of 10. And by the time he was in his 20s, he got into a revolving door thing with suicide attempts and brief hospitalizations. But between all of these episodes, he managed to get a master's degree and 2 BAs and became self-educated as a computer programmer. And I kind of put him in my own mental category of a high-functioning bipolar. But he wasn't diagnosed with the bipolar till well into this cycle. And the last episode he had ended the cycle. And it was probably his most serious episode. And I won't go into the details, but he somehow miraculously found a provider. I took him to a
What do you have? Do you have a
hospital
particular
facility
question?
that had a mental health unit, and they he just happened to find somebody who brought him through, and he hasn't had an episode for 20 years.
Wow.
And anyway, and what I'm
Well, what's your
getting at
question?
is that there are times when the system works and times where the system doesn't. And he had a lot of system failures before he found one that worked. And anyway, I just want to kind of applaud what you're doing. And
Well,
see if
thank
we can
you.
make
And
some headway.
thank you. And thank you for sharing your personal story. And look, this is what NAMI is about. If you whether you're experiencing crisis now or it happened to you 20 years ago, if you need a place to go and talk, we're not therapists, okay? We're family members. We're just regular people who have lived experience. We have support groups, we have classes, we have a lot of resources. They're all for free. And that's what we do, is we help people in crisis, help them to some degree reconcile what's going on in their lives and be able to go on with their life, even though things aren't perfect and things aren't the way we would like them. So by all means, there's NAMI chapters you can find in LA County. NAMI GLAC, which stands for NAMI Greater Los Angeles County.org. You'll find all our chapters. Dick's old chapter of the Pomona Valley is one of ours. We have 6 chapters throughout the county. And by all means, find the one closest to you. And you can always sign up for classes and support groups if you need help. We only got like 3 minutes. So real quick, Sophia and Maggie, I'll try to get you two before we're done.
Yes, can you put Grace Napolitano's bill in the chat? And then at the county level,
Okay.
I've heard testimony that we don't have the healthcare professionals in the public or private sector to deal with the need. The other question having to deal with funding, because at the end of the day, it needs to be funded. We had the Lowenfeld bill of 1%. You think there's a way of having another tax on the rich, maybe 0.5%, to focus specifically on this community? And then the other one is when you deal with single payer or Medicare for all, the bill is always never passed because they have part of the bills, and it's very difficult for Democrats to understand that you can't put people within the hospital industry appointed by the governor to police themselves. And then it becomes this dialogue that you're against Medicare for all. Of course not. The point is, when it's fiscally not prudent to put people that are in the hospital industry to oversee it, it's never going to get passed. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
Well, you gave me 3 questions. I'm trying to remember the first one. I should have written it down. The first one was, help me.
We don't have the medical professionals to deal with
Right.
the need.
So the workforce problem, we're running a mental health system with 30 to 40% vacancies. Right. Remember, these are civil service jobs. So the county is upping pay. We are doing incentivizing people. I think the state could do more. I think we could have state programs that incentivize psychiatrists, for example, go to medical school, become a psychiatrist. And if you work for the public system for 5 years, maybe we help cover tuition, those kinds of, they do that with dentists. They do that with lots of different medical providers. So I think the workforce issue, even if we had the money, we got nobody to hire, right? We hired about 150 clinicians last month at the Department of Mental Health. So we are hiring more and more all the time. We don't have scale and we don't have the capacity. And that's a resource issue. That's a money issue. So we're kind of out of time, but Maggie, you want to ask a quick question? You're muted. But by the way, I tend to get kind of wonky because that's who I am and that's where I live. So a lot of NAMI members come in and sort of tell their story, and it's very gut wrenching and heart wrenching. But I work on policy. I work on legislation. I work on the criminal justice system. I don't want people with mental illness chained to benches in the inmate reception at the jail, sitting in their own feces and urine. That's what's going on. So anyway.
Yeah. You mentioned that you had a detailed article that you had written.
Written lots
way
of
back
stuff.
in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned.
Podcast, actually.
A podcast. So I want to know how we can get a hold of that. Oh, the link is in the chat. Okay.
Link in the chat. It's Heart
Yes.
Forward LA. And basically I talk about a lot of this just in more detail.
I'll look it up. Yeah. The other thing is, did you say that you live with your son now?
No, my son lives about 10 minutes away in his own apartment, which essentially we pay for. So, he gets a disability check. You can't live on disability. You can't live on SSI. You get $950 a month. So
Ridiculous.
He gets a better disability check since I filed for Social Security now that I'm older. But and he does great. Matter of fact, he's coming over for St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. And he's coming over for corned beef and cabbage tonight with his brother.
Do you use the LEAP method?
Yes.
To communicate.
So she's got the book, I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, by Dr. Amador. It's we call it NAMI required reading.
Yeah.
Your
well,
homework.
I have a new way of saying LEAP because I can't do the agree part. I say listen, empathize, accept, and partner.
Well,
I cannot agree when he tells me I'm to blame for everything.
No, I don't think that's what Dr. Amador means, but we're
No.
kind of out of time, so we'd have to do
Yeah.
that at another time. But actually it's listen, empathize, affirm, and partner,
Affirm. Oh,
not agree. So you're
okay.
so you're
that's,
so everybody
you
wants
solved
to
my
be
whole
heard.
problem.
So everybody wants to feel listened to, right?
Listen,
Everybody
affirm.
wants to receive empathy for how they feel. So I'm really sorry that you think the FBI is tapping your phone. That must be terrible. I'm affirming it, right? I know
Yeah.
if I thought somebody was tapping my phone, that would make me really upset too. Now I'm affirming.
Till I
What
really
could
have
I
to
do
look.
to help? Maybe if you tell me how I can help you, trying to get the person to buy into something positive and treatment, what could I do to help you get what you need so you wouldn't feel this way? So that's sort of listen, empathize, affirm, and partner. It's a
Actually, in
great
the
book.
book-
It's called I'm
in the
Not
book,
Sick, I
it's-
Don't Need Help.
Yeah, but in the book, it is agree.
Oh, where is it? I learned it as affirm.
Well, I
Well, you
like affirm and I can accept affirm.
Good. I'm glad you're happy.
You
I'm
agree
very
where you
happy.
can.
Chapter 8, agree. Yeah.
So I realized this was sort of wonky and detailed,
Hmm.
but
Beautiful.
after doing this for 20 years, it's not enough for me to just tell a sad story. And I've got one, just Dick will tell his when I'm gone here today. But I want change. And there's a lot of other NAMI members and people who are not NAMI members who are done with the excuses. And we want change. And we're not going to get it unless we fight for it. And so we become advocates. And I decided a long time ago that that was going to be what I worked on. I sort of do more with government and these days than I actually do with NAMI, except on the criminal justice system where I'm really engaged with the county. So that's what I work for. So that's my focus. Other NAMI members would give you a very different presentation, but I'm working on things that I think will change the system. So
Mark,
thank
I
you
want,
for inviting me today, and thank you all very much for your great questions. Really, really
Thank you
good
very
questions.
much.
And somebody asked in the chat how we can help. You can support issues that we support. We have to find a better way of getting out to the community when there's a Board of Supervisors hearing and we support a motion to get people to call in. It's actually quite a bit of work. Maybe someday we can put our position papers in real time on our website. That would be the only way you would know what we are supporting. But, we watch the Board of Supervisor hearings every week, for things that we know are coming up. So the sign on to state legislation, send a letter of support, lots of things your organization can do. I mean, I could give Dick a list of bills that I'm following that you guys could look at yourselves.
do it.
Support.
I'll
I'll email
here.
that to you, at the end of the day, Dick.
That'd be
But-
terrific. I'll see that everybody gets it.
Okay.
And Mark, I knew you wouldn't disappoint. And I must say that as a father of a son with a serious persistent mental illness, from the depths of my soul, I agree with everything you said. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
asking me here today, and all of you be well. And
Thank
if you know
you.
anybody who's struggling with mental illness, send them to NAMI. We'll help them out.
Great presentation.
Thank you very much. Take care of everybody. I'm going to get my workday started.
Thank you.
I'll see you. Bye-bye.
I don't know how he does it all. He's a full-time banker.
Oh.
And the banks are going through some tough times, but he did this anyway. He could be working 24 hours a day with his bank right now, and because of all the issues, but
Mhm.
really shows something about the depth of his commitment. Okay, I've been asked to add a few words, and before I get into the jail issue, I just want to make a few comments about Dr. Amador and I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, his book. It took me a long time to recognize that the best thing I could do for my son was to listen. And believe me, that's hard. You know, he would go off and there's this just crazy ideation. And as an example, at one point, he was absolutely convinced that I was a robot. And so I would, listen to him, and he'd go on and on about how I'm a robot. And so when he'd finally be finished with this whole thing about that, I would say, okay, Rick, are you convinced that that I've been listening to you? Because I've been asking questions, I've repeated back, which is what I would typically do. And so he'd know I was really listening. And so is it okay with you now for me to share what I think? Are you ready for that? Okay, I'm ready. This might be a half an hour after he had gone through this whole thing a few times. At which point, I would simply say, Rick, I would agree with whatever I could agree with. Rick, I'm sure that there are things about my behavior that could remind anybody, including you, of a robot. I do the same thing over and over. You can often predict exactly what I'm going to say. And there's a part of that I really agree with, but I want to tell you something. In essence, I'm not a robot. I have a heart, I have a soul. Sometimes I surprise even myself with things I do. And so it took a long time. And even when he was back in a more stable period on his meds, everything seemed to be, almost normal. I could ask him, Rick, do you still think I'm a robot? And that ideation gets in there so deeply that if you really talk to somebody who seems reasonably stable, the ideation often is still there. And they'd say, Dad, the voices were really strong on this one. So I can't quite let it go. So quite a while later, when he was able to hold a job and doing so much better, I asked him again, Rick, do you still think I'm a robot? He said, Dad, no, I don't. I realize you're not a robot, but I need to tell you something. The whole time I was growing up, I had the hardest time getting your attention because you always had this long, long do list. And I always sensed that the primary thing in your life was to get back to your do list. And I had to wedge myself into it to be heard. And I'll tell you something, sometimes what you hear from somebody who has a serious persistent mental illness has truth at its core. So it's easy to just brush it aside and say, oh, here he is again, it's a nonsense. Well, maybe it's not total nonsense. And that's where the agreement part comes in what Amador is saying, that you can reach a point where you say, something, I see there's a core of truth in what you're saying to me. Emily Dickinson got into this and said, there's some genius in the midst of mental illness. I don't want to romanticize or overstate that because it's an awful disease. But communication is so crucial and it's so difficult. I will say something quickly about his jail experience. And I want to, before I get into that, I want to say that that he, about 12 years ago, got exactly the program he needed. He was in clinical trial. He was in a period of stability because of the meds happened to be perfect for him. And so my wife and I sat down with him and we said, Rick, we really think that you've managed to get your college degree and you'd qualify for a training program for social work. And this training program is done by Mental Health America. And the belief is that you, through all your experiences of homelessness and jail and hospitalization and travel all over, that and meeting all kinds of people, that you're in a perfect position to help other people who have been through what you've been through. And long pause, And he said, I think you're right. I think I'm ready. So we got him into a training program run by Mental Health America to help this man who had been through it all, to help other people who were going through it all. And that changed his life. He started he took his meds, he started doing regular exercise. He felt needed. He felt he could contribute. And even after that, in the middle of his training, he went through a sudden depression, felt inadequate for what they were asking of him in his field work, and he tried to kill himself. There he is in the hospital, just a total mess. He recovered. They continued to work with him at Mental Health America, and now he's married. He's very proud of his new car, has a very responsible job in the mental health field, and he's profoundly respected. People just love him. But it hasn't been easy. For 20 years, he went through this cycle of homelessness, jail, hospitalization, and some periods of relative stabilization. He's not, even to this day, the person that he would have been had he not had this disease. I mean, the neurons in the brain get thrown all over the place. The neural pathways get all messed up when you have schizophrenia. And he was a particularly paranoid version of schizophrenia. So even now he'll have, he's doing great work. Everything's great. He loves his wife. She loves him. But there will be these sudden little dips where paranoid or delusional thinking will come in. Fortunately, he works for an agency that understands that. And so he's secure in his job. But but he was one of these. I'll give you a little extra background. And do I have like 5 more minutes, or are we okay with that? He was in Occidental College and doing very well. He was always one of those model kids. A great athlete, student leader, advanced placement. I think on the IQ charts, he was way beyond me. Partway through college, his whole demeanor changed, his hygiene changed. He wasn't maintaining his belongings well at all, and particularly his VW, which he had loved, treasured. He wrecked it. So one day he invited Pam and me to have lunch with him in Pasadena, which is right near Oxy. And he said, I'm going on the road. I'm leaving college. I'm through with it. And we weren't totally surprised. There had been paranoid behavior. We got occasional phone calls in the middle of the night, that kind of thing. And of course, we tried to talk him out of it, but good luck with that. And about 6 months later, he returned and he was a vegetable. He sat on our couch and did almost nothing. When he did go out, we really worried. One point, he jumped off our roof thinking it was a bird. It was just another time he got on his bicycle, which he called Danger Bird. He didn't have a car anymore. Rode his bicycle all the way to San Diego, starting off in the middle of the night. How he survived, it's just a miracle that he's still alive. Suffice to say that he did jail time. And jail is a convenient default when busy police officers don't know what else to do. The police forces are often understaffed, and there's so much going on, and they're called in on a 5150, which is the state institution welfare code, whereby a person can be apprehended for the very behavior of danger to himself, danger to someone else, or gravely disabled, can be apprehended by the police, taken into a mental hospital. But sometimes they don't have time for that. They stick them in jail until they have time to get back to them and then run them over to the mental hospital. And then they get in the mental hospital and they get, they're on a 3-day deal and they're out again, temporarily stabilized on meds. Then they're back 5150 and the police say, "Oh, you again." So anyway, jail is a normal part of the handling of people with mental illness. Rick was probably in jail a half dozen times and all over the country. And it was bad for him. He didn't want to talk about it, but we could tell from his behavior when he came out, he was more angry and more racist. Now, this from a person who just loved everybody in high school and in college early on before he got sick. It didn't matter if they were white, black, Latino, it was just come on, come all. He was just so in love with humanity. Suddenly, then next thing you know, he's really down on both blacks and Latinos. Well, finally, we understand that when he went to jail, the disproportionate incarceration that goes on in our society, he saw all these blacks and Latinos, and he was judging them, thinking, well, they must just all go looking for trouble. So then when he's out on the streets homeless, he was afraid and suspicious of blacks and Latinos because he's seen so many in jail. So it's just, jail is not helpful most of the time. But I do need to say that there were 2 situations where jail helped him. And this has to be said in fairness. He got in jail in New Orleans of all places. And the warden in the jail in New Orleans called us and said, we're subjecting your son to some tests, and we don't need your permission, but we need your advice, and et cetera, et cetera. We had a great conversation, and we got the best diagnosis of his illness from that jail system than we had ever been able to get in LA County. Then he was taken into San Bernardino, in the jail system there. They made sure to move him through the hospital system into the kind of housing that would be supportive in Ontario, which was near where we live. And that was hugely helpful to him. LA County, we never had a positive experience. I mean, Twin Towers, supposed to be, delivering, this up to speed mental health program. Back then when he was so sick, not the case. Twin Towers was dynamite for him. So it's hard, we can't totally generalize about the criminal justice system or the legal justice system, as Steve Brody prefers to call it, realizing it. I mean, the criminal legal system, as Steve likes to call it, because it's often not particularly just. But suffice to say that too often the jail experience is exceptionally negative. It hurts his self-esteem, made it harder for him to get on the road to recovery. But now for about the last 12 years, he's been on that road. And we just thank God for that. And all the friends, all the people, all the mentors, all the skilled people who have been part of that.
Well, thank you, Dick. So much of that speaks to me and my experience. And I don't want to take time to go on and share all my relevant experience, but anyway, do we want to take some more announcements from outside our circle here?
I think Maggie and Steve had their hand up.
Okay. Oh,
Maggie?
you're muted, Maggie.
Was your hand still up, Maggie?
I just didn't know, I didn't know I was supposed to take it down. I'm sorry, I see the lower hand, but I do have a question for Dick.
Sure.
Go
Um,
ahead.
just really quick, John has a way back when he was in his mid-20s before he started getting better. He was arrested for domestic violence for a minor domestic violence, but it still came in as a misdemeanor domestic violence. And he's afraid that if he applies for a state certificate, was your son able to get certified as a mental health worker in spite of his jail time?
Yes, he was. Yeah, there was a process involved, but he cleared, and yes.
Because he's had it all expunged and all that, but they say when you try to get a certificate as a nurse, for example, it's going to be more serious. So how do I find that out?
Yeah, let me research that for you. Let me work with you on that, okay?
Thanks.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay, Anthony and then Ruby.
Okay, thank you, Dick, for being so vulnerable and sharing. And this has been very powerful for me. And I really appreciate how complex this is. But I do have one really, this is a field I'm not that familiar with. So I just wanted to be clear. I've heard a lot of controversy about the care courts. And I just want to make sure I understand what I'm hearing. What I think I'm hearing is that right now, the go-to for people with serious mental illness is incarceration, because it's really hard to get them into the proper kind of care that they need. Is it your understanding that the care courts might help some of these people to get 30 days of care or whatever they need to sort of stabilize so they can move in the right direction? Or do you feel that the care courts, as some people are saying, will not work because it's basically another form of criminalizing of people with mental illness and forcing them into treatment that they don't want? I just need to have clarity about your feelings about the care courts.
I think that the care courts should be very good with diversion. The problem is lack of resources. You can divert into supportive housing, you can divert into certain form of therapy. The question is, will the resources be there waiting? But I want to say something about the care courts. It's an incredibly important step forward, just conceptually. When the major hospitals were closed down in the 1970s, and Reagan was moralizing about all of this stuff, I think we all know that the local services were not there. The care courts bring the court system closer to the local level. And that is a very important venture on the part of the court system, to go as local as possible, so to be at ground level as much as possible. And hopefully then the care courts will develop real expertise about, the resources that are available, and B, will have some role in increasing the resources. And I don't know quite how that all can play out, but the idea is excellent.
Just one last follow-up. Is this your view, or is it also NAMI's view?
It's NAMI's view too. NAMI
Okay.
is in favor of the care courts.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to say
Ruby?
something about care courts. I wanted to say something about the care courts, that depending on what station you're booked at, that's been also a failure at the county level. You just may be criminalized and not even given that option if the officers don't send you. There's not enough judges to deal with it. I think the station issue has to be resolved.
I saw it. Steve, were you wanting to speak to this? 'Cause
Yes,
I-
thank you. We had the ACLU here, and I just circulated on email why we vehemently oppose the governor's care court proposal, and so should you. So there's obviously a wide range of views on this. Some of us may remember we had Eve Garrow and Kath Rogers here. Maybe we should have a follow-up session. It's probably a complex issue with a lot of subtleties to it and not a black and white one, but I do want the group to know there is that side from the civil liberties standpoint and due process. I really raise my hand to thank you, Dick. Thank you for bringing this program together. Thank you for introducing us to Mark Gale. What an extraordinary individual. I thought he was doing this 100% of his time, and you're telling me he's a banker. But thank you for who you are. Thank you for who you are to us. Some people may not know you were the first chair of ICUJP following George Regas. And you're an extraordinary human being, and I'm probably embarrassing you, but as a father and a grandfather, and with your beautiful wife, that you have come through this with Rick is just an extraordinary human story. And everybody has their own life path, and you have led it with grace and honesty and candor and love. Thank you, Dick.
I second the motion. We have Ruby and Carol Francis, and we're running out of time, so please try to make it brief.
Yes, Dick, I was not able to get in on this. I'm going to listen to the whole information, and I want to let you know that I also have a Rick who I've gone through things with, and still, even though he's going into 60 now, that he's made the choice to make the change. And you standing behind your son is just wonderful, because that gave him the ideas that yes, he can make the change and go through what he's going through. I know with my son now, he decided to go forward. I'm not saying go back to school, but go forward to school and go forward to college, which is great. I'm wondering about the website. Was there a care court's website, or this website I saw that you had put on the, that says get attachment, all of that? Was that something that we could look up, or what?
Yeah,
That's in the chat. Or do you have a simple one, or I can call
Yeah.
you later and get one?
Yeah, there's about 5 or 6 links on the chat.
yeah, just follow those out, see where that takes
Okay.
you. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. I was able to get in on your conversation. So thank you so much for the sharing. Peace out.
Okay, Carol Francis.
Very quickly, somebody spoke to us as an expert in the program, to us teachers in Watts, about the brain manufacturing chemicals in response to what it perceives in their environment. So a child who grows up in a hostile environment, either from domestic violence or gang violence or police violence, is likely to not be imagining threats later in life, but their brain has created the chemicals that cause them to respond. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, Richard.
Yeah, I maybe someone else on this screen can. I'm not aware of that one. It sounds like an excellent question, though, Mary Frances.
Thank you. Thank you. This guy came and spoke to us teachers, and it just blew me away. just changed my whole perception of so much.
Yeah. Is Sophia, is your hand,
What's up? My question is because I was having this discussion with Dr. Rockbar when it came to lead and then comorbidities and environmental racism and the effects of the brain. I don't know of anyone who's done that correlation in the criminal justice system or dealing with mental health. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that.
yeah, I'm not versed on that. I must say that when my son improved so dramatically, I felt I continued to work with NAMI until new leadership arrived in our local outpost and the county level. And so I moved on working with homelessness, which is certainly related in many situations to mental health issues. But I've not now for about the last, I'd say 6 years, been directly involved with mental health issues. So I'm not up on some of the very latest stuff. But before we close, I just want to thank all of you for the way you received Mark and your tremendous questions and that quality of soul that is part of this organization that keeps it going. Just such a deep, passionate commitment to justice and peace and love. And thank you for your kind remarks, Steve. This group really does mean a lot to me. I can't get your announcements most of the time because my computer rejects them. But when I get them, I come. And so
Okay.
my computer is not a social justice advocate.
But I can say, Richard, if you just come every Friday, we're here every time, and it's going to be a good program, whether you get the announcement or not.
Yeah, but I need the link too. I guess
Yeah.
I can go back
Oh.
to the old link and use it over and over.
It's
But-
kind of like a speakeasy. You need the password to get in.
Hey, Dick, would you be willing to close us out after our closing circle?
Sure.
Great. Well, let's draw together in a circle holding hands and share important things that we would like to share and then move to closure. Maggie?
No, I was just holding your hands. I was
Yeah.
holding hands of the person next to me. It happens to be Steve Rohde and Phil Way.
All right.
Well, I'm going to speak right up because we talk about our personal concerns and hopes and worries and for matters of to put on your hearts. And my wife's facing some real health issues, kind of scary, and we don't know where it's all going. So just know that my beloved love of my life is, we don't know what the future holds at this point.
So sorry.
Her name is Pam.
A former minister of neighborhood church, Greg Stewart, has several sons in their 20s, I think, and one of his sons had a serious accident and is in hospital with brain injury on life support. That's very scary and very touchy. So hold him in the light.
I alluded to his life earlier when we were talking to Mark, but like I said, Jim Gordon was really one of the big musicians in LA, and he played on everything. And if you listen to Eric Clapton's Layla, the piano part at the end is Jim Gordon. And it's such an uplifting, soulful thing that that's the way I prefer to remember him.
Okay, Dick, can you close us out then?
Sure. Well, let's imagine ourselves around that circle holding hands. And I think that as we hear of needs and think of those close to us who do have needs, and think of the larger society, which is so torn in so many directions, that we have a lot on our hearts and minds. And let's be aware that there's a reality in our midst of love and care that is beyond mere words. And to rest knowing that, rest at that deep level within ourselves, so that when we go out to bring change, to face the conflict, be called into question, we have that inner sense that love is at the very core of who we are together, within this organization and throughout the world of peace and justice and love. So we can have a better world. It is out there waiting to be made a reality. It's out there waiting for us. So let's get on out there and do what we know we're called to do. Thank you for this time together. Amen.
Amen.
Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you.